200% in terms of the number of end clients they serve. As a business, we need to remain sustainable. We've seen growth, and we've been able to achieve this in a sustainable way, where we've grown our revenue tenfold in the last 3 years. And that's important when building a sustainable business. So it's not just about the effect of delivering a service and delivering a project, but that has to be going on a regular basis. Globally, we've achieved this in 12 countries. We're servicing 80 financial institutions and now have reached 4 million end clients. It's 4 million end clients are on our platform. And again, this is an effort that has been done in partnership with our customers. The part about working with our customers is really important. This is a photograph from 2 weeks ago of our community summit. So we actually work with our customers to constantly get feedback from them, to learn from their requirements, and to constantly update them about the new functionality we have on our system. We're encouraged through our business model to help our customers grow so that we can grow. In reflection over the years, we started in 2012 in my daughter's bedroom. We've grown since then. We started in Nigeria with our first pilot project. We wanted to make sure that we could work in the most hardest to reach places, and it was a good testing ground. 3 years ago, we came to the Philippines, and today in the Philippines alone, we have over 50 financial institutions, both regulated and non-regulated. I repeat, the component of high touch and high tech is really important. We've learned this through partnership with our customers. We've learned that if you're enabling the community, the financial institution who is representing these end clients, if they have the tools and the means to better serve their customers, if they can spend more time and teaching their customers about the education required behind every loan, behind savings, behind other financial services, we can all grow together. So the combination of technology with high touch is what makes this possible. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I'll be able to.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We have a few minutes. The first question comes to in my mind. How did you start that project in your daughter's bedroom?
So it's really like I was in the industry beforehand, and we had a vision, and we had no money to start, so we were just cutting corners, and we started very small. And through friends and family, we did crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, and we get the project up.
Okay, my daughter doesn't have her own bedroom yet, so I definitely need one. So, how do you bridge the gap between slow regulation and being nimble as far as your core banking solution is concerned?
Work over time. What we found is by working with the regulator and actually understanding their objectives, you can actually move quickly. Now, often we hear regulators are moving slow. Things do take longer. But if you take the time to help explain the regulator what needs to be done and work with them. So what I like to think is we form part of their strategic objective rather than being a pest on them and saying, when are we going to hurry up, when are we going to hurry up. And in the Philippines, the BSP is one of the most forward-looking regulators. So in that case, we have been very fortunate to be able to exercise this vision with great success.
So how long was your implementation cycle for this project in Mindanao?
It's offhand, I would say maybe about a year, just over a year. There was a lot of learnings about this process. So I wouldn't say it's a regular implementation in that because it was regulated, it has to work within the constraints of the regulator. And this is where the ADB played a really important part, where they were able to facilitate discussions of how do you analyze a core banking system that is traditionally offline, going online, where you have permission to go forward, but the rest of the team within the BSP haven't been, the nodes haven't been updated. So that's an example of what was going on through this project with the ADB. And I think that's an important lesson. We've also learned other things that were required, and it helps us to adapt the system. Moving forward, these implementations will stay quicker, and they usually go at the pace of what the clients can deal with in terms of migration.
What about internet connectivity?
I love this one. So, ironically, the best, what we find is electricity is often more of a challenge than connectivity. We've designed our system to work on really low bandwidth, so basically 2.5G. And lastly, we have the capacity to work offline, so that you can actually collect transactions, digitize, and then
So we are running out of time. One more time. Thank you very much, Antonio. And we're going to have Auradian also presenting in the marketplace, and you can, of course, meet Antonio and his colleagues outside as well for further conversations. So last but not least, there's only one more presentation to go, and then we are not coming together anymore in the afternoon because you're going to have choices to make. So this is our special session. We want to introduce you to the Fintech Policy Toolkit, learnings from the Commonwealth's Fintech Policy Toolkit, and we are very happy to have a recognized authority on financial innovation here in the room. He has worked with many corporations and governments. He also leads the Oxford Fintech and Oxford Blockchain Strategy Program. Please give a warm welcome to David Schreier.
Thank you. All right, are we on here? Great. So my voice is kind of fading a little bit, so forgive me if I have a little trouble projecting, but I'll do my best. So what we're going to speak about today are policy toolkits, right? And before we get into tech policy toolkits in particular, I find it always helpful, there we go. I find it always helpful to remind folks that I work with that people do not buy technologies. They buy solutions to problems. And so in all of our work around these tech policy toolkits, we try and emphasize the need for solutions. And before I go any further, is the feedback too much on this? Because I can switch to a hand mic if it's, no? Okay. All right, so let's set some context around why we might want to put together a fintech policy toolkit. So a lot of money has gone into fintech in the last 5 years. Nearly $400 billion US has been invested in fintech companies from venture capitalists and private equity firms. In fact, nearly 40 billion just in the first half of 2019. And there are new sources of financing that are not part of the traditional venture capital and private equity world. So people are doing token issuances and raising tens of billions of dollars for blockchain companies without going through conventional sources of financings. And so now we have really interesting and well-funded companies popping up in places other than Silicon Valley or Shanghai. It's also a time of great change. So, and I think we've lost all of our animations. All right, we'll go really fast through this presentation. I had all sorts of fun animations, but looks like we're not going to see them. So identity is a major issue that is coming through. Today we have heard a lot about inclusion. Identity is a gateway to inclusion. We had a workshop yesterday on digital identity. About 1 billion people in the world lack any identity whatsoever. And so the UN has set a sustainable development goal around identity. We've also heard today about the underbanked SME market in the opening keynote. And we also see new data, new technology that's promoting access, that's creating opportunity. This also opens up cyber vulnerability. So we are also seeing more aggressive hackers. We also see platforms. This was going to be a fun animation. We also see platforms arising. So WeChat has over 1 billion active users, and more than 20% of them are tied into financial services through the WeChat platform. And we find in our discussions that a lot of central bankers and finance ministers and policymakers are not typically constituted to grapple with how to appropriately regulate a platform, although that is changing. And so we saw, for example, recently with the reaction around Libra, that there is greater sophistication that's starting to enter the dialogue around how to grapple with platforms offering financial services. There's still a lot of regulatory confusion, however. Right? So last year, Greg Metcalfe's directorate at the OECD did some examination of what's going on with cryptocurrency regulation. And out of the G20 in this conversation, we had everything from banning crypto outright to creating explicit regulation around the issuance of cryptocurrency. It was all over the map. And even in the course of the last 9 to 12 months, some of these countries are changing their stance The US has started getting a little more restrictive. South Korea has started getting a little less restrictive. There's been a lot of change happening. So this leads us to the conversation about tech toolkits, and particularly fintech toolkits. Now, toolkits are nothing new, but we frame the conversation of toolkits in the discussion of how do you create an enabling environment for technology-driven innovation? And that's the lens through which we're going to look at toolkits. So there have been some really great work done on toolkits. Alliance for Financial Inclusion, for example, has a great financial inclusion toolkit. I recommend it to you to take a look at that. You know, the Oxfam has done some interesting work around responsible data management. So toolkits are nothing new, but we are seeing increasing use of more sophisticated toolkits that drive more directly to impact. So our theory of change around a fintech toolkit is the following. We want to build capacity, right? We want to help non-technical people better understand these new technologies. We also want to create a pathway to applying that knowledge. One of the things that helps us do that is illustrative case studies, right? So we say, all right, here's how this particular country or regulatory body handled this particular question in looking at artificial intelligence or cryptocurrency or blockchain, whatever the question might be. And then we nuance the conversation because, you know, for example, with one of the toolkits that I was helping lead development of, you know, the Commonwealth spans 53 countries and 2.4 billion people in every continent on the planet with a major country. And so how do you do that sort of mass customization? And so you have to get into nuance, right? So the way we do that, we have tech topics. So we're trying to help people understand in very plain language what big data analytics is all about, for example, or, you know, cybersecurity. We provide some frameworks around how to achieve desired policy outcomes using those technologies, which technologies are applicable where. And the case studies, again, help to illustrate this. And then finally, we get into a lot of nuances around things like, you know, stage of economic development, connectivity. In the Asia-Pacific region and ASEAN, we want to look at things like the legal heritage because of the variety of different legal systems in play. And so to get into a little more depth, we went through a consultation process, and for one toolkit that we developed, these were the 6 topics that we concluded we should explore in more detail. There are an array of new technologies that are emerging that we decided consciously not to go into depth on because of the particular needs of this project. So for the Commonwealth FinTech Policy Toolkit, we looked at artificial intelligence, blockchain, digital identity, big data analytics, digital financial services, and cybersecurity. You'll notice some of these are more horizontal and some of these are more vertical. But these were some of the areas that, in discussion with our stakeholders, they were asking questions about. And just to give you a single example of something we decided not to go into depth on, we decided that quantum computing is too far off to be relevant for a 2 to 3 year horizon of significant regulatory import. It's coming soon, it's important, but it's not important yet for this discussion. We then said, okay, now that you have some basic vocabulary around these new technologies, how would you go about applying them, for example, to achieve greater financial inclusion while still complying with AML KYC, right? So a discussion that came up often in the development of this toolkit was the issue of de-risking and how perhaps technology can address the de-risking issue of financial services institutions going in the direction of financial exclusion because they cannot afford to comply with current regulation. We then built this out into some specific case studies for a set of countries. So PNG, for example, with the PAPO-NY and DigiZen solution. So the DigiZen guys are just out in the hallway, and it's worth checking out what they're doing. And so this was helpful in trying to take some of these higher order concepts and make them very tangible and tactical. Because going back to our first principles, we're trying to help people solve problems. So we have to provide some tangibility. Something we haven't built yet, but that we sort of recommend, is model law development. For some countries, it can be helpful if you've got kind of an off-the-shelf solution that you can just tweak a little bit for addressing something like, let's pretend, digital privacy and personal data. So it's a highly consultative process, right? It begins with some initial design and a consultation workshop that incorporates private sector, government, academic, and nonprofit stakeholders. It's important to have a multi-stakeholder view on, are you building the right toolkit and are you asking the right questions? Then we go into a lot more depth on interviewing stakeholders, going through multiple rounds of drafts, getting feedback. And then once we've got our sort of core repository of knowledge, we need to get into dissemination and ultimately capacity building and technical assistance. So we frame this in the broader context of we're trying to drive change at scale using technology. We want to solve big problems. So our digital classes are in over 130 countries, helping innovators create new businesses and ventures. We put the books together to help support that as well, and then work with a number of governmental and non-governmental bodies to try and spread the word and then bring the word into action. So, I'm happy to answer questions. I know everyone is anxious to get to lunch. We are running a little behind time, but I think we do have time for at least a few questions. Is that right? Yep, okay.
So, use the app first.
Okay. All right. What is your take on countries adopting cryptocurrencies as a national currency? So I think that these central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are really interesting development in the market. They're interesting because they can help reduce significantly cost and help create greater transparency and reduce corruption. So there are a lot of interesting advantages to these CBDCs. However, something that I think more conversation is needed around is, and we were talking about this in the hallway, interoperability. And what I mean by that is that currency needs to interface with other currencies in the region. And so how do these digital currencies talk to each other? So one of the projects that we're really interested in exploring is this question of creating a regional digital currency that's stable, that's backed by the goods and services that are produced in the region, and that allows multiple governments to participate. I think this is important because right now we've had the sort of waning of the US dollar hegemony over the world. And the question is, what's going to replace that? And I would argue vigorously, it should not be Libra. And I think it's important that multiple countries have a voice in what that new currency looks like. And that's why I'm interested in this sort of regional or multi-governmental digital currency. Okay, I guess the next question. Is it workable in the Philippines? Here we go, okay. How do you suggest working with regulators to be more open to adopting new technologies given their reasonable paranoia about the threats of bleeding edge technology? Well, I mean, from the outside, regulators can look monolithic and scary. And in my dialogue with regulators over the last several years, I have found that there's a wide spectrum. There is no singular regulator. And that you can find often that regulators are seeking to engage in dialogue with industry and understand new spaces. And so if you're in industry, take advantage of those opportunities. Because a lot of, particularly tech companies, are guilty of their first encounter with a regulator is when they get an enforcement letter. But a lot of the regulators I talk to are holding consultations and forums and showing up at conferences and trying to understand new developments long before they get turned into government policy or into regulation or interpretation. And so if you are a startup, I mean, this is a great venue because we saw the statistics at the beginning of the day. You know, a third of the folks in the room are from government. There's a tremendous opportunity right now, today, to talk to regulators and policymakers and folks who have influence over regulation and policy around where things are headed. So I've been working hard, just as hard on getting tech companies to be better about talking to government as I have helping government be better at talking to tech companies. Let's see, cyber. How do we make fintech trustworthy for consumers? Well, you know, better cyber education is important, better cyber literacy. I got to tell you, more than 60% of cyber breaches are due to human action or error. Even RSA, the company that provides cybersecurity technology, got hacked because 4 people inside of EMC, the parent company, opened phishing emails. And then the hackers were able to use the EMC network to drill into the RSA network. And RSA does those key fobs, you know, the security tokens for secure bank accounts. So, so we've got to improve people's understanding and change people's behavior. Consumers have a lot of trust in certain brands. And so one way that fintech can become more trustworthy for consumers is alliance around those significant brands. Another is, and this is where, you know, some effort is required, banks as a class of institution tend to have a lot of consumer trust. And so without going crazy and just adopting any fintech that walks in the door, I also spend a lot of time encouraging banks to experiment a little more in trying out and adopting new technology. So some of the institutions in this room, for example, have embraced the cloud, which I think is great. Some of the big 10 banks that I know of don't believe in the cloud, and they insist on everything being installed on premises, which is cost prohibitive for most interesting fintechs. So I think getting greater tech literacy inside of the bank to embrace fintechs and leverage your existing cybersecurity infrastructure is a way that we can bring consumers along this journey of trying out new technology.
So let's take maybe 3 more questions.
Okay.
David?
Let's see. So we talked, well, all right. So I'll just quickly answer cloud versus on-prem. Cloud is not as scary and cyber insecure as a lot of people think it is. I'm a big fan of cloud, but it's not a solution for everything. So it's situation dependent. And then what is your, let's see. How much does this kind of consultation service cost? Which consultation service? What, mine? It depends. That's like asking, what, you know, how much does it cost to buy a house? Well, do you want 5 bedrooms or 1 bedroom? Like, tell me a little more. Okay, Euro started as a digital regional currency. What is your take of an ASEAN currency? I think it's a great idea. And I think it'll build stronger cooperative trading ties amongst the ASEAN region. All right, last question. I'll take the tough one. It's a little down the stack. The Oxford Digital FinTech courses are very expensive compared to cost of living in emerging Asia. How can they be made more accessible? This is actually a pet peeve of mine because we deliver a very high touch experience with these classes. That's part of why they're so expensive. So we really would like to be able to offer them more widely. We are experimenting with new models, but we would also love to see greater support from foundations and development banks on scholarships, so we can raise fintech literacy in the region. Okay, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, David, for this energetic presentation, and he will be around so you can ask him how much the 1 bedroom or the 5 bedroom costs. I'm not sure if you get an honest answer, right? Okay, thank you so much. So that's it for the morning. So 3 announcements. Can I have the slides for, yes. So you have to take a decision. You already decided, I think, on registration, but we don't have a meeting police. We will not have security at the door to check if you're going to the room you showed interest in. So session 4A, going cashless, is in multifunction hall 1, that's on this side. Session 4B, Brave New Lending, it's in the middle. And obviously, session 4C, microinsurance, is on this side. Meaning it's probably advisable that you don't leave all your belongings spread all over the table. Yeah? So that's what's going to happen right after lunch. So we're going to have a 1 hour, 15 minutes lunch. So when you come back, please come back on time, because sometimes the moderator